man sits in the shade of an ancient cedar tree. He can look beyond the hill to a distant city that's clearly visible from that hilltop. He uses his long fingers to caress the trunk of the tree that provided shade for him as it did for his father before him. And then he takes his hand and he begins to touch some letters that are carved into the trunk as if he were reading Braille. He touches the letters. It's A, D, A, L, A. And he whispers, Adala, as he feels tears running down his weathered face. His brown skin speaks of many long years working out in the sun. And his stubby beard is more neglect than tradition. He takes a drag of his cigarette and he begins to weep even more. And his mind travels back to when he was a youth, when he was young. He sat under the same tree with his bride-to-be holding hands. And he had taken a small knife and he carved her name in the trunk. And he promised that his love would last longer than the old tree. Well, Fadi and Adala were married. And they lived happily in a small, humble house that he had inherited from his father. They were poor, but they managed because he worked on the field of the small plot of land that he had inherited from his father as well. It had been in his family for as long as anyone could remember. And that tall cedar tree by the house provided shade for them when they sat there in the evenings, dreaming and planning for their future. Now that they were expecting the first child, that city in the distance became alluring to them. They talked about selling their house and their land and moving to the city where their child could have a good education. But when they were all talked out, it all came back to the small plot of land that Fadi loved so much. No, he couldn't leave this place. It meant so much to him. It was like a second mother. He could never leave his mother. Well, their son Akio was born, and he became their pride and joy. The boy grew quickly, and soon he was out working in the field with his father. One day in early summer, Fadi, Adala, and Akio were sitting under the cypress tree looking at the sunset beyond the city when they noticed a plume of smoke coming from behind some buildings. Word spread quickly that the anti-government rebels were spreading their war to overthrow the ruler. Fadi began to wonder if they would be safe on their hilltop. And he was also concerned because Adala needed to travel to her mother's village. Her mother was ailing and needed some help with chores, and the village was near the city. He wanted to tell her not to go, but he knew it was a daughter's duty, so he cautioned her about the dangers. Well, the next morning, Adala, with a long hug and a kiss, bid her husband and young son goodbye, and she promised that she would return in 4 days' time. When 6 days had passed, Fadi became concerned. So he left Akio in the care of a neighbor, and he set on the long trip to his mother-in-law's village. He got there late evening, just before sunset. The village appeared deserted. There was no movement, except for a few stray dogs that wandered about. And then he heard some commotion coming his way. It was a funeral procession. One of the mourners told him about the massacre. See, 3 days earlier, government troops had marched into the village to recruit every able-bodied man. And when the villagers protested and they begged them not to take their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their sons, that's when the shooting began. Those killed were mostly women and children. A few survivors, they set up a makeshift morgue in the school where they prepared the bodies for burial. Fadi didn't know what to say. He was speechless. He ran to his mother-in-law's house and it was empty. Fearing the worst, he ran to the morgue. Adala wasn't there. Someone told him he should check the clinic where the wounded had been taken, and he went to the clinic, and that's where she was. But it was too late. The doctor told him that she had died just before he got there from her wounds. Fadi wept like a child. And he picked up his wife, and he carried her all the way home. And as he walked up that hill, he could feel her body become stiff and cold. And with a weeping child and a neighbor, he buried the love of his life under the old cedar tree. Now, his sorrow turned to rage, and his rage turned to hate. He hated the government, he hated the army, he hated the rebels, but most of all, he hated war. Well, Fadi raised his son as best he could, and Akio grew into a handsome young man. And now, he sat under that cedar tree, weeping and whispering his wife's name. And with tears in his eyes, he said softly, Adala, I'm doing it for our son, but I promise you that I will return to be with you forever. And with that, he got up, he walked to his house, packed a few bags, and with his son, he began the long and dangerous trek to the border of the neighboring country. An old man sits by a window. The creases on his face speak of another time, another place, and the faraway look in his eyes show his longing for something he left behind: a wife, a land, a life. There's a young girl holding his hand and looking at him, smiling lovingly. She is his granddaughter, Adala. She knows all the stories about her grandmother, after whom she was named. She knows about the name carved in the tree. She knows about the beautiful hill that overlooks a distant city. She knows all the stories. As time passes, the old man begins to wonder if everything he longs for actually existed, or if it's a dream that he had once. Sometimes his eyes begin to play tricks on him. When he looks out the window, instead of seeing buildings and houses, he sees ruins. Instead of cars, he sees tanks. And instead of people passing by, he sees soldiers marching to war. One day, while sitting by the window, he hears a gentle voice calling. It's his granddaughter. She's come to tell him that the war has ended in his country. The old man begins to weep and say a prayer of thanks to a God he thought had forsaken him. And then he feels a pain in his chest. But this was not like the pain that he often felt when he longed for the things he left behind. No, this was deep in his chest, and he couldn't breathe. He tried to speak as he held the young girl's hand, but no words would come out. A young woman sits under the shade of an ancient cedar tree. In one hand, she holds a decorated wooden box. With the other hand, she traces letters that are carved into the trunk. A, D, A, L, A. She whispers, Adala, as tears run down her face. She looks down at a city in ruins. But beyond the city, there is a beautiful sunset that could almost make her forget about the destruction, about the pain, the suffering. Then she opens the box and she begins to sprinkle the contents under the cedar tree. And the ashes rise up with the wind and the breeze, and they swirl and they look like tiny stars as they dance in front of that bloodstained sky. Then the young woman takes a small knife and she begins to carve letters under the name Adala. She carves F-A-D-I. Thadi and Adala are together forever.